Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3, Shadows of the Change DLC, to talk about the most ridiculous unit that is part of this particular DLC. It's not the Tangors, which are heavily armored units with magical attacks that you can recruit at tier 2. And they also have a silver shield, so they're quite very strong in battle. In fact, in my Changeling campaign, I've been making heavy use of these guys. They will last for a fairly long time in battle. They'll do a pretty good job at it. And if we look at the Tangors as well, they do get Primal Fury for extra speed. The speed that these guys have is quite incredible. And they also get Arcane Charge, which increases in intensity when nearby allies or enemies cast spells. So if you're dealing with someone that's going to cast a lot of spells, the Tangors are going to be extremely powerful. But it's not them. It's not the Vortex Beast either, though it is quite a very powerful monster. It doesn't necessarily have the best armor, but it has a good amount of HP, magical attacks, anti-large, armor-piercing damage. It also has melee attack for allies in range, causes damage to combatants with the aura of mutation, and it is, of course, a demon, but it also causes terror. This thing will do a significant amount of damage. In particular, I think like its AoE ability, and I'm not just talking like about the fact that it basically has a Master Rune of Spite attached to it. No, I'm talking about like its melee attack that this one has will do a very significant amount of damage. Then you have the Cockatrice, magical attacks again, armor-piercing damage as well. Most of its damage being armor-piercing flying unit. Not the best armor, but of course the barrier will help keep it alive, and it does poison. Pretty nasty unit, and also slows down the enemy by quite a fair amount, and has a fair amount of missile resistance. This does help offset its relatively poor armor, though. Bear in mind that it does have its own weaknesses. I think like infantry that are anti-large can handle it, but it's not the Cockatrice. For Cafe, it's also not any of the Cafean units. The Onyx Crowmen, honestly, like people have described them as just basically harpies for Cafe, and I kind of agree with that sentiment. I haven't really seen a reason to use these guys. Of course, they can give you visibility range, which is always really nice to have for a unit, and they do cause fear, and they have Vanguard deployment. They can be a decent enough scout unit, I suppose, in battles, but I haven't seen really a reason to recruit them as Cafe, maybe as a scout for the Cafean artillery. If we're looking at the other Cafean units as well, we do have the Jade Lions and the Jet Lions as well. So Jade Lions, they're flammable, so they cause the flammable effect. Most of their damage is armor piercing. They have no force penalty, and they have a good amount of physical resistance, and have a power recharge of plus 20% attached to them. As well as the Jade Lion Breath bounce spell, which can do a decent amount of damage in AoE. Or not AoE, in like a cone. Then when you look at the Jet Lions, it's a yin unit. It has a spell resistance of plus 20% for units in range, causes fear. Missile resistance again, has the Strider effect, and also has the Missile Mirror that you can obviously use. Pretty decent units. The Jet and Jade Lion certainly worth recruiting. Actually gives you a reason to get the building that they recruit them from, because you wouldn't necessarily need that building. I mean, you would get one for an Astromancer, but that would be about it for much of your early game. But now it's like you can recruit two really powerful single entities with these guys, and they'll do a fairly decent amount of damage in a fight. The War Drum gives various effects that you can use, so you can either get armor or you can get melee attack and immune to psychology. With respect to this unit, it gives you you also have the mastery of the elemental wind. So when two or more units in the same army share this attribute, this attribute intense increases the power of spells cast. So that can certainly be useful and gives a leadership benefit to allies in range. It's basically a buff unit, though I think like it could really benefit from an extra range on its ability, because right now you're not really going to benefit necessarily that much from one of them. But it's none of the units from Siege or Cafe, so that leaves Kislev. Now, Kislev gets the thing in the woods. Now, these are basically flesh hounds of Khorne, but given to Kislevs. They have bones versus infantry, and most of their damage is armor-piercing damage. Not the best armor in the world, but certainly a fairly nasty flanker, and a pretty powerful unit as well. That like they can hold their own in a straight-up fight. They do have 20% physical resistance, and they cause fear. So a fairly decent unit. Like this, I think, like fills the role that Kislev really needed in terms of like an early game cavalry. Because if you look at the winged lancers and the Griffin Legion, those are charged cavalry. Those are not cavalry that stand in a fight. I mean, sure, you can, of course, you can of course use the sleds, but still, and warbears later on in the campaign. Then you have the Incarnate Elemental of Beast, a pretty juicy unit, all things considered. So it has the Incarnate Flock of Doom if its HP is greater than 25%. It has 20% physical resistance, causes terror, has siege attacker, has bonus versus anti-large, so it's good in terms of killing other monsters, has most of its damage done for armor piercing, and has magical attacks which can ignore the physical resistance of enemies. But it's none of these units. Instead, it is the Akshina Ambushers. Kislev's special forces, and I use that term special forces because you look at these guys, they have scopes on those crossbows. In fact, when you look at the trailer that Creative Assembly posted for Mother Stankia, you kind of like get the feeling like, I just got that feeling early on, what is this, Call of Duty against demons? Make a modern Warhammer game, wouldn't that be something, right? But these guys look fairly ridiculous, like the scopes is like, Kislev must have really good relations with the dwarves, what can I say? I mean, scopes do exist in the Warhammer universe, so it makes sense, but it's like these guys are pretty absurd as a unit. And then there's, of course, the Regiment of Renown. So looking at these guys, keep in mind these are a tier 2 unit. Now, I don't think there's a problem with them being a tier 2 unit because they're pretty expensive. Like, they're just as expensive as Streltsy. You can just recruit them a tier earlier. They're generally more useful than Streltsy, with one exception. They do the same damage as Streltsy, of course, but the problem with that is that Streltsy are handgunner units, and handgunners are not particularly useful in Warhammer 3 because of the limitations on gunpowder units. That is not a limitation that the Akshina Ambushers will have because they're crossbow units. So looking at these guys, they get Vanguard deployment, hide, stock, so they can actually avoid taking a lot of damage until they're ready to deal damage. This is useful because their low armor, their lack of missile resistance or shields, means that you could actually win range duels against them. Like, High Elven archers could kill these guys if they were detected. So staying undetected until you're ready to pounce is going to be very important with these guys in certain compositions. But they're stealthy, and most of their damage is through armor piercing. Like, they do 20 free, they have 20 free missile strength. To give you an idea, these guys are better than, I think, the vast majority of range units in the game. The only range units that infantry units with this number of models that are better would be like things like Sisters of Avalorn, and honestly, these guys can compete against Sisters of Avalorn in terms of raw damage, though they do like the flammable attacks and magical attacks that the Sisters do have, unless you're playing Mother Stankia, in which case her entire army has magical attacks. But in terms of like raw armor piercing damage, these guys can compete with most units. It's only like the high-end Wood Elf ranged units that are better than these guys, like better in terms of their range. Like, High Elves do have greater range. These guys don't have the best range in the world, but they're certainly capable of doing a significant amount of damage from range. They have really good leadership, and they're actually pretty decent in melee as well. Not the best, but their melee attacks are armor piercing, so most of the damage of their melee attacks is armor piercing. So even when So even if these guys run out of ammo, they can actually do a decent amount, do a fair amount in a melee fight if that ends up happening. But they do have a fairly high amount of ammunition as well. Now, here's the thing about these guys. They're expensive. So in a Kislev campaign, Kislev having a poor economy, it is going to be a struggle to mass these guys in large numbers. I would recommend early on in a campaign that you still get a bunch of regular Kossars, but then you get like 4, 5, 6 of these guys in every army for those for those heavily armored units like Warriors of Chaos. So this unit in particular is well designed to handle the heavily armored units you will deal with in a Kislev campaign. So Archeon's units, for instance, Azazel's units. Then we get the Wolfhearts, the Regiment Renowned version. These guys are just a beefed up version of the regular Ambushers. They do 7 more missile damage, but if we look at the difference, they do 2 regular base missile damage more. They shoot faster, and also they do have 2 more armor piercing damage, but their missile strength is 30. Just better stats all around the board, and crucially they also have the pack trap that can affect one enemy in range from a range of 100 meters, and you can basically stop an enemy unit that then strikes and then, well, just kill it before it even gets to you. These guys are quite ridiculous. Like, these guys will delete units, like the Akshina Ambushers in general will delete enemy units they encounter. Like, there's a particular quest battle that Mother Stankia has relatively early in her campaign where she has to go up against a demon of Nurgle. So I think I've put one right there. Not seeing it. But these guys are quite good in a fight. They're quite very strong. They'll do a fairly good job. I think, like, they're not quite lore accurate, and I don't think they necessarily fit in this DLC, but they do solve one of the problems that Kislev had in its roster. Because Ice Guard, they're more of a support range unit that's meant to help slow down enemies. That's great about Ice Guard, but Streltsy are not great because of the handgunner limitation. So Creative Assembly's solution apparently is to give us a really powerful range unit that's available 1 tier earlier than that, but costs the same in both upkeep and recruitment cost. I think it's the exact same cost as Streltsy. I imagine there's still some use of Streltsy. Like, Streltsy are going to have better armor, so they're going to be able to take damage better than these guys, but like they do the same damage, but of course Streltsy have that handgunner limitation. These guys are going to be better at clearing walls, clearing units in a battle, not dealing with any kind, not having issues because of any kind of elevation in a particular battle. And that would be all. Cosine here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.